Now, you may have noticed the Prime Minister's been at COP28 in Dubai, where he urged other countries to step up as the UK leads by example. This is what Rishi had to say.
I'm here at COP28 with two clear messages. First, the world needs to do more to tackle climate change. We've made real progress, including at the Glasgow summit, but the climate science and mounting evidence of climate-related disasters show that we're not moving quickly or effectively enough. So I'm calling on major emitters to dramatically accelerate delivery on what they've already promised. Everyone can do more. And let's be very clear, the UK is leading the charge. We're absolutely committed to our net zero targets. We've already decarbonised faster than any other major economy. Our emissions are down 48% since 1990, compared to limited cuts from others and a 300% increase from China. We're also one of the largest climate donors because we want to help those suffering the impacts of climate change. My pledge from September of £1.6 billion for the Green Climate Fund was the UK's biggest single climate change commitment. And we're going further, announcing £1.6 billion today for renewable energy, green innovation and forests, delivering on the historic Glasgow deal to end deforestation, because we can't tackle climate change without nature. We're also leveraging the genius of the City of London to deliver billions more in private finance. Again, the UK is leading by example, and we need others to step up. Because my second message is this. As I said in September, we won't tackle climate change unless we take people with us. Climate politics is close to breaking point. The British people care about the environment. They know that the costs of inaction are intolerable, but they also know that we have choices about how we act. So yes, we'll meet our targets, but we'll do it in a more pragmatic way which doesn't burden working people. We've scrapped plans on heat pumps and energy efficiency, which would have cost families thousands of pounds. We'll help people to improve energy efficiency and cut bills, but we won't force them to. We'll support nature across the UK. Just this week, I announced a huge new effort with 34 landscape recovery projects, a new national park and more. And we'll harness the opportunities of technology and green industry to deliver net zero in a way that benefits the British people. And today, I can share more proof on the progress that we're making. I'm pleased to announce a new deal between Madstar and RWE, which includes a commitment to jointly invest up to £11 billion into the UK's new wind farm at Dogger Bank, which will be the biggest in the world. This is a huge boost for UK renewables, creating more jobs, helping to power 3 million homes and increasing our energy security.
So there we go. The UK is leading the charge. Well, we're certainly leading the charge to give away flipping great wadges of cash. And joining me now to discuss this is Elliot Keck, Head of Campaigns at the Taxpayers Alliance. The thing that gets people going about this, Elliot, is it's billions and billions and billions of pounds committed over the years. Nobody was ever consulted, and presumably the vast amount of taxpayers would rather this money was spent domestically.
Yeah, and I think in particular taxpayers would like to be consulted, as you said. I think when we look at major conferences and summits like COP, part of a much, much broader programme, I think the Prime Minister, the King, anybody that's representing the United Kingdom at this summit needs to remember that they're there to represent British taxpayers, and ultimately that's who they're there to represent. And so when we start talking about these absolutely massive pledges, these absolutely massive decisions, Rishi Sunak and his ministers and his diplomats need to ensure that they're putting the British people first.
And what kind of numbers are we talking about? They're telephone book numbers, but what kind of figures are they giving away?
So let's take COP27, which was held at Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. That led to the creation of something called the Loss and Damage Fund, which is there to essentially compensate developing nations who are impacted by climate change. And it's estimated that that's possibly going to cost the United Kingdom around 11, 12, 13 billion pounds, depending on who you ask. By 2030, that's about £2 billion a year. That's a substantial amount of money. There's also the United Kingdom's commitments to the International Climate Fund. So these are absolutely gargantuan commitments, and it's part of a very, very long process of the United Kingdom funding major multilateral organisations, global quangos, as the Taxpayers Alliance calls them. And we've found that £85 billion has been spent between 2009 to 2021 to fund some of these massive organisations.
Those numbers are eye-watering, and they're sums of money which could go a long way domestically. We were handed thin gruel at the autumn statement, for example, in the form of a 2% NI cut. People were expecting a bit more. Do you think people have every right to feel a bit dischuffed with the notion that we're getting hardly anything given to us in our pockets and purses and wallets in Britain, and yet we seem to be chucking away billions on the international stage to climate funds?
Yeah, and increasingly being dictated to by the very same organisations that we're often one of the largest funders of, which I think is particularly grating. I think there's definitely a sense that we don't get the gratitude that actually the United Kingdom deserves for funding these organisations, for being actually one of the world leaders in climate change and net zero targets, and that's even including Rishi Sunak's recent softening of some of those policies. So I think the United Kingdom does need to seriously look at the way that it funds these organisations, some of its commitments that it funds as part of its involvement with these organisations, and seriously look at whether that is actually value for money for British taxpayers.
And at the Taxpayers Alliance, it's all about the money. And to taxpayers, to the British public, it's all about the money. Now, we know that the commitment was in the Tory manifesto pledge in 2019 for net zero. However, there were no figures next to it. Nobody knew what it would cost. So the concept of saving the planet, of course, people want to. When they discover the cost, things change. How unpopular are these kind of notions when you talk to taxpayers? Yeah,
I think, again, if you put forward the basic proposition that do you think that we should protect the environment, it is popular, but then when you ask people, would you be willing to spend £15,000 on a heat pump when your boiler is actually in perfectly good working condition, then people tend to call on the proposition quite a bit.
And the same with an electric vehicle, and the same with insulation, and there never seems to be a carrot. It always seems to be a stick. Like my car, perfectly good car, 40,000 miles on the car, mine's a diesel. I can't drive it anymore without paying Sadiq Khan £12.5 a day. And there are many, many people, the working classes, the hard workers, who can't afford to replace their vehicles. They can't afford to replace their boilers. And they don't need to, they shouldn't have to. And yet they feel these kind of policies are forcing them into a corner.
Yeah, and incredibly blunt instruments. Let's say you're driving that diesel car down Regent Street, you'll pay the same amount as if you're driving that diesel car on a quiet road in what is essentially the UK countryside when you get out to areas like Uxbridge and Bexley. So some of these are very blunt instruments, and when government starts using blunt instruments, taxpayers feel like they're being punished, not that they're being asked to make a genuine contribution, and that's also a huge problem.
Great stuff. Thanks for joining us in the studio. Elliot Keck, Head of Campaigns at the Taxpayers Alliance. Always a pleasure. Thanks for joining us on the show. Well, joining me now is Philip Blond, former advisor to David Cameron. Again, thanks for joining us on the show, Philip. Thanks for coming and talking to us. So we just heard there the problem with this kind of stuff with the British public, with the taxpayer, isn't the concept of saving the planet. Everybody wants cleaner air. Everybody wants less emissions. But when it comes down to the nuts and bolts of the cost to individual taxpayers, we start to hit some resistance. And so my question to you is, when we see Rishi Sunak on the global stage at Dubai giving away billions of pounds, do we really expect the public to fall into line behind him?
Well, I mean, he himself said, the UK makes up less than 1% of emissions. So what we do won't make any difference if China or the US don't get behind climate change transition. So I think that your point earlier that you were discussing, I think it's just very odd to try to make ordinary working class people on low or medium wages pay the cost for something that won't make any difference. Heat pumps, if you look at what they're due to impose in Scotland, very expensive, will push people into genuine, not just fuel poverty, but arguably poverty itself. This isn't a good way to proceed to reach a good end. However, where I think it is merited, I think, look, if you look at some of the figures for the consequence of climate change, in Africa, for instance, and across the rest of the world, it will drive massive waves of migration. People offered a choice between dying or moving will move. And if we in the West don't want to face unprecedented scales of migration, something to make the small boats look like a small issue, then it's behoven on us to invest in those countries such that people have a genuine choice and can stay there and and build happy and prosperous lives. So I think that is merited. I also think there are other things on the agenda that are well worth doing. So they're talking about green tariffs. That is, places like China can produce steel, for example, without any of the rules that British steel is forced to produce. So that it's much more carbon intensive in China. And because that comes at a lower cost, they can outcompete us in both domestic and world market. Well, if COP28 introduces green tariffs, then we have a level playing field for our goods and our services, and we're not making ourselves uncompetitive. So I think that is to be welcome.
Do you think China would even pay attention to such things? I mean, they don't even go to COP28. Does COP28 or the global organisation therein have any fangs to tackle China? I mean, you know, it's all fair well saying China is the biggest polluter. We know that. We know that India is one of the biggest polluters, and yet they carry on regardless, and we seem unable to tackle them or tax them, and instead net polluters who are very marginal, very small like the UK, the taxpayer seems to be paying. And this notion that we should pay African nations to stop them migrating to Britain is a real brain bender. We have 745,000 coming here already. You said unprecedented migration. We already have that. So explain that to me.
And it's going to get worse. So what I'm saying too, so you may raise two very good points. You're quite right. These things don't have fangs, but what they do is they force Western nations into action. So green tariffs, the EU has already committed to this. The US is considering something on the back of the CHIPS Act. And if Western markets essentially impose carbon tariffs on material produced in China that produces more carbon, that is making the polluter pay. That is the only thing that will change Chinese behavior. And actually, if you look at the Chinese plans, they plan to open 300, I'll repeat it, coal-fire stations by 2050. So it's going to get a lot worse. So it's very important that we start to have, if you like, a polluter's wall around China, where we make sure they can't produce goods on our backs, if you will, by forcing us to pay green costs, but ignoring them themselves. Secondly, your point about migration. Yes, it's bad now, but it will be several orders of magnitude greater if we let states collapse due to essentially climate change. And this will pale into insignificance. If we're in the tens of thousands now, we'll be in the millions. And that's something to avoid.
Okay, Philip Blond, former advisor to David Cameron, a somewhat apocalyptic version of the future. We could always try just controlling our borders rather than giving billions to Africa. I don't know. That's an old-fashioned notion.